Hi everyone, I'm Arjun Worthy of the Factual.
And I'm Jill Soley.
Welcome to Factual Fridays. This is our first one, and the objective is to help you get caught up on the news of the week, particularly if you've missed out on any stories, help you get all the facts from across the political spectrum so that you can reach your own conclusions.
Well, let's get started. It's a big news week.
Oh my God, was it ever? What was the big story again? Yeah.
Was there something big happening?
Something about Russia. So the Russia-Ukraine war obviously dominated the headlines, certainly in the last 48 hours, but over 1,000 articles in just 48 hours from that we crawled and analyzed and grouped together on our topic page. Yeah, quite a lot about it. So, I mean, you've obviously heard about it. Any questions that come to mind or any things that you thought about?
Well, it's interesting because if you listen to Russia, right, if you listen to Putin specifically, right, sounds like, he's on a peacekeeping mission and they are saving Ukraine, saving the Ukrainians, right? But there are a lot of other voices that would suggest otherwise. How do you make sense of that? How do you make sense of what's really going on?
This is such a complicated topic, actually, despite, a lot of headlines make it seem really obvious, like Putin is clearly the wrongdoer, the evil guy, NATO, the West are clearly good, and it's a good versus evil battle. So obvious. And there's no question that Putin's actions, his verbiage, are not really what you would expect of a peacekeeping sort of president. His motives are clearly not entirely clear and above board. But the story is actually much more complicated. So the Factual, we looked at a couple of articles. So, high level, everyone knows that Russia recognized these breakaway republics in eastern Ukraine and said, these guys are predominantly Russian speaking. They anyways really like us. They're really being persecuted by the Ukrainians. We're going to come in and help them and save them effectively.
Right. This is what Putin has been saying.
That's right. The backstory to all this, there's a few things that were going on. The first is that Putin, of course, has grand ambitions to, sort of rebuild the old Soviet Union, and that's really a big driver.
Right, and so there's a lot that just goes back even as far as Gorbachev and so forth, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union.
He's a former KGB officer. He thought, the Soviet Union had some real highs, and is unhappy that Russia's not seen as that world power. He's also seeing this expansion of NATO, and NATO progressively adding more and more partner countries that are effectively circling the western front of Russia. Now, NATO forces, as they join, it means that they can put missile batteries on borders, they can have troops doing training exercises. And now imagine if the tables were reversed and Russian allies were surrounding the United States and putting missile batteries and doing all these exercises and saying, hey, it's just, training, we're not doing anything. Of course that's going to put you a little at unease. And so that is definitely one part of the story, is that he legitimately thinks NATO is sort of pushing and encroaching or certainly threatening Russia. But then I thought, the part that really threw me for a loop when I first heard his statement, Putin's statement saying, we're going to go into eastern Ukraine and denazify it. And I was like, what? Where did that come from? And I thought, this is just bluster. It doesn't mean anything. But if you look, we found this article from Jacobin, which is a left-leaning periodical, very good, highly rated article, that talked about how the U.S. through CIA is probably arming and training neo-Nazis in eastern Ukraine because they wanted them to fight these Russian separatists, but of course the U.S. can't really officially get involved. And so in 2015, when the U.S. passed this budget, they explicitly carved out a line to allow funding to this group called Azov, which is a neo-Nazi, like a legit neo-Nazi group. It's like, wait, what? And so, it's unlikely that by itself is justification for this war. But my point is, the U.S., as has done so many times, has armed one group, which is some sort of rebel group, in a geopolitical conflict. And it always raises tensions whenever the United States does this, or the West more broadly. So I thought that was interesting. And then the other really interesting thing was, so the U.S. supplies arms to the Ukraine, billions of dollars of arms, and has been helping them fight these separatists in the East, drone warfare, things like that. And the U.S. has even done joint training exercises. So now again, from the Russian point of view, you're like, wait a minute, Imagine if Russia sold arms to a country right next door and is doing training exercises and is fighting these separatists. Of course, separatists, understandable, but they're Russian.
And Russia, they went into Crimea and so forth, but it's not like everything's been peaceful and the United States has been...
But even Crimea is a very interesting one in that, ethnically speaking, they're largely, almost entirely Russian-speaking in Crimea. And so for year after year, they've been polled, and the majority, somewhere between 55 and 70% of Crimeans have always said, we actually would prefer to be with Russia. And then they hold this referendum in 2014, I think, where suddenly 97% said they wanted to be with Russia. So it's like, okay, hold up a minute.
I was going to ask there, right? Like, how do we know these polls are accurate?
So I think what it basically amounted to was that, yes, there was probably, like with all of the things happening in Ukraine, there's always a kernel of truth that is then seized upon by Russia and exploded to its own benefit. And frankly, in geopolitics, that happens all the time. A little bit of something blown out of proportion.
Right. A little bit of something turning into Russia, invading Ukraine on all fronts.
Yeah, exactly. Seems a little...
Doesn't quite sit right.
And of course, even if everything that we said was 100% true, it does not necessitate a military operation in another country. Whatever the Russian president may believe about separatists and all this stuff, doing military operations explicitly in another country with bombings, supposedly, we're not going to occupy, but really you're bringing in heavy artillery. There were options beyond that. So I think when you put it all together, it says the narrative that Putin is way beyond what he should be doing, I think is roughly fair. But also, all these other articles, there's one from the American Conservative, which is a moderate right publication, which really outlines, U.S. history when Georgia had a similar issue. So in Georgia, I want to say about 7-8 years ago, there was a breakaway republic called South Ossetia. And again, Russian sort of separatists. And the U.S. said, you guys be harsh on them, we'll be right behind you. And then when Russian forces sort of came in, then the U.S. was like, we can't really sort of get involved, and Saakashvili got overrun. So there's sort of history in the Caucasus of a lot of bravado, and then the U.S. not necessarily being able to follow through with military action, and then the Russians sort of overwhelming them. And basically saying we're not, and I say we, I really mean the West, is not a reliable partner in some ways to all these countries. So I think it just adds a little bit more color to what's going on there, that it's not such a simple black and white thing. There's definitely a line that has been crossed, and there should be penalties and economic sanctions and all will follow, but there's a lot more going on behind the scenes. And by the way, one of the other really interesting angles to this is if you look at Russia's foreign exchange reserves, they're a very, very, I think maybe an all-time high at this point, compared to, maybe 7 years ago, 8 years ago. And a big part of that is that so many people now buy Russian gas, right? Natural gas. And so if you want to really dial it back to something even closer to home, it's about energy independence. And when you lose energy independence, who are you dependent on? And therefore, how does it affect geopolitics? So Germany and many of these Western countries saying we're going to go all renewables, or certainly we don't want to have coal and fossil fuels domestically, but we'll buy natural gas, puts them in a position where now Germany is saying, actually, Ukraine, you should never join NATO because we know it would anger Russia. So, man, lots of chess pieces. It's really quite fascinating, actually.
Which is also impacting what they're doing today after the invasion, right? Because
that's right.
There's a lot of fear around implementing sanctions. Right?
Yeah, exactly. So when sanctions go down, and they will absolutely go down, there's more than one party that gets hurt in this. And so even here domestically in the US, you've seen gas prices already start to go up. And I can only imagine in Europe it's going to go up even faster, because they're going to feel the brunt of it much sooner.
Yeah. So how do you make sense of it all? There's a lot going on. There's a lot of context. There's a lot of history. Yet, you go to sort of CNN and so forth, and it's just a lot of the same thing. You're not sort of getting the depth. How do you find it? How do you know what you're getting?
Well, so sort of a shameless plug for the Factual then, I'd say, we have this engine that crawls and grabs all the related articles, groups them into these topic pages on the web, and gives you context on the political bias of these sites, because there's so many sites now and we don't even know how reputable or credible they are. And then we have this the Factual grade, which is our grading system. It tells you how informative and objective an article is. And so you can go to factual.news. You can just click on any of the trending topics. In this case, it'll say Ukraine, invasion, and you'll see all thousands of articles, and it'll be sortable, searchable, summarized, etc. So it makes it really easy for you to expand your viewpoints beyond the traditional CNN, Fox, for example. And what you'll find is that there's fantastic journalism, really in-depth, very informative, often though not from sites you know well. And you will see great reporting on both sides of the political spectrum. It's not sort of monopolized by the left or the right. And so then when you read lots of different angles, you're like, wow, that's complicated. But then you start to get an appreciation for there's no easy answers. You want to scream at the television set or whatever and say, why didn't you just do this? It's like, well, let's talk about that. This would happen. This, it's quite. So that's kind of the upshot of it.
Yeah. So, Russia, Ukraine is the big story, but there's still some other news going on.
Yeah.
There's one particular story this week that's pretty near and dear to my heart that we can't have this discussion and not cover, right?
I agree.
As a sort of soccer coach and ex-soccer player, the U.S. women's soccer team, had the biggest win of their careers. What's the news there?
So I think a lot of people are probably seeing the headlines that the U.S. women's soccer team, the national soccer team, won this judgment that said they should be paid equally with the men's national soccer team. It's yet to be ratified. I think the men's side has to agree to certain terms and share prize money.
Which seems like a big if,
so
right?
If this is what you want as an outcome, I would say don't celebrate yet. Let that agreement get signed. But nice to see that happen for everyone cheering for this. And a long time coming. This has been, 3 years, I think, at least. And Megan Rapinoe, one of the star U.S. women's players, has been on this charge. I think what's really interesting on this one is the arguments for and against it. And the Factual, we ourselves run daily polls with our readers to ask them what they think. So we asked, do you guys think the national level teams should be paid the same for men's and women's sports? And it was about 58% no, and I think about 35% yes, and some unsure, something like that.
Wow, 58% no.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people, and the readership of the Factual is, broadly speaking, a good cross section in the United States, across all 50 states, and across all sorts of socioeconomic classes. So I think it's a reasonable guess that this is probably public sentiment. A lot of the pushback comes from people who want to talk about it in pure market economics terms, saying, look, no matter how much we want equality in things, the reality is the men's tournament brings in a lot more money. So why should we try to equalize across the men's and the women's teams? They bring in 10x the money, is kind of the argument.
So in soccer, where the women have been winning consistently,
of course,
right? I mean, these women are a force to be reckoned with.
Yeah.
And the men, what are the men doing? They didn't even qualify last time, right?
That's right. Yeah, they lost a very sad game, actually.
How much of that is because of, them and their playing and so forth, and how much is because of the marketing around it and so forth that actually draws?
That's right. And so for the people that voted yes, they said exactly what you said, saying, look, it's a little bit of chicken and egg. Like, at some level, if you fund one side at 1/10 the amount, what do you expect to happen?
Right.
You can't keep saying they get 10x, and by the way, why do you not draw so much in? It's like, well, that's the equality. So I think there's definitely an argument to be made there. But so I'd say, in soccer, women's soccer actually is getting closer and closer to the men's side. The level of play is getting better and better. To also be totally honest, the men's side does have a higher level of play. Just the sheer volume of players that are trying to compete for the club levels, it's insane, right? If you think about every team in Europe, that's all men's. Like, women's leagues have it, but men's is like 8 times the number of leagues.
Right, but that's the thing. Like, the women here in the States are, a force internationally.
That's right. Yeah.
Whereas the men here,
not so much.
They're not so much, right?
Although now it's nice to see, the U.S. has a star player named Christian Pulisic who plays for Chelsea and is a fantastic player, won the Champions League. So I think the men's players are getting better. But yeah, relatively speaking to Europe, the men's team is not as good, but the women's team is so much better compared to world leagues. So I'm hopeful, and I think this is what we're sort of seeing. The sentiment.
And that's only one argument. I mean, the women's team, what they've been doing for girls all over the country as role models and getting more girls to play and all of that stuff, right? Which will, of course, then...
Yeah. I think what's also really important to see is that, people want to separate the distinction between national level teams and professional level teams. Most people are not saying that, for example, the WNBA players should be paid the same as the NBA players. No one's saying LeBron James's salary must be equal to the best player on the WNBA. What we're saying is when you're a representative of the national team, this is a national thing. It feels more reasonable to say, why is this not equated? You're representing the country. This is not just your professional job. Because I think if it goes to the professional side, there's all kinds of professional employment issues that will start to come up, right? Like, where would you draw a line in equality? But I think it's different in national level stuff. Certainly, if you could think even like Olympic level stuff. Would we want to pay our players differently between men's and women at the Olympic level? Most people would say that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah.
So it might be that this is the first peg in a long string, and it starts out first with soccer, and it starts out at national, and then it just progresses to more sports. And maybe, who knows, goes past national at some point. I think a lot of people would be happy to see women's sports get a bigger stage. Why not?
Yeah, why not? Yeah. It was wonderful for me to see, I have two boys, and
You took them to the World Cup, didn't you?
I did not take them to the World Cup.
I thought you did.
I have taken them to see the women's hockey team when they were here locally. But when it was on TV, I mean, they were totally into it and watching. It could have been men's team. It could have been a women's team. The world is changing from when I was a kid, right?
The national level team is really fun to watch. I think, and the Women's World Cup, actually the Women's World Cup, it was the highest draw ever for women's soccer. And I think there was some stat I saw where it actually trounced men's for some other sports. I don't think it was the FIFA World Cup, but it was also like a bunch of sports.
Right.
So it's no longer just a smallish thing. It's a big deal now.
Yeah, I'm excited about it.
Me too.
Yes, I have a bias, 100%. But
I have a daughter who loves soccer, and I'm soccer mad, so I would love to see her be excited about the sport as well.
Yeah, awesome. What other news? Like, what are we likely to have missed this week? Is there? I mean, there certainly are other stories that we probably have caught any number. But what should we?
The other one that I thought was really interesting this week, because it sort of affects all of us, is the UK lifted all pandemic restrictions. So on Monday, Prime Minister Boris Johnson said, "We're finished. We're lifting all of it." I think there's some restrictions, like if you're working inside a hospital or settings like that, you may still have to follow some protocol, but outside of that, no more. And it's a big deal. It's a big deal. And of course, it's highly controversial because, Omicron is still spreading. There's still people getting sick. And the number of people getting sick, even though most of it is very mild, but the sheer number means you're going to encounter some serious cases. It could potentially clog up hospitals. So is this the right call? And I think on this one, like everything with the pandemic, so very difficult. And not a good, easy answer. I'll put aside the political mudslinging. Like, there's an argument that people make that Boris Johnson's doing this to avoid the spotlight on his, Partygate, where he,
Right.
And I think that's neither here nor there, and I try not to be cynical about these things.
There have been arguments throughout, right? It's a tough one. The economics of masking and requirements and, business, the impact on businesses and health and safety.
Yeah.
Right?
And so there are a couple of undercurrents on this that I think are interesting. Is one, the UK has, I'm going to get this slightly off perhaps, somewhere around 80% vaccinated people. I think that's single shot vaccinated, not necessarily double, but higher than the US, which is plateaued in the mid 60s or maybe 70, I think, for single shot. It's not apples to apples. They do have a higher vaccination rate. But I think it's also an element of, look, we're doing this testing thing and we're making tests free for a long time or heavily subsidized. And that's costing the UK government a lot of money. Yeah. And so at some point they're like, okay, how long can we keep running this red ink? And so the finance minister, Rishi Sunak, is also taking a close look at it and arguing with Sajid Javid, who's the head of health and services. So there's an economic element just for the government itself, and then there's sort of the social elements of it. And then from the scientist standpoint, the public health folks, their argument is, I know you guys all want to lift this, God knows we do as well, but who's to say that variants don't continue to develop and the next one is bad like Delta? Rightly so, they do their job, which is always to be prudent. But then the job of the leader is to balance all these competing forces. And I don't envy Boris Johnson. I mean, sort of a damned if you do and damned if you don't.
Yeah, we've had the same thing here in California. We've had the same thing across the United States.
Yeah.
Right? That there really is no way to win on this one.
I don't think so. I mean, I'm pragmatic to some degree, which is we're all going to learn to live with this. What that means might vary for different families based on your health situation, based on vaccination, immunocompromised, children, elderly adults, all kinds of variables.
Yeah.
So I think we all have to make the decision that suits our families first, not necessarily rely only on the high-level government advice. And then, take the precautions you need to. I mean, that's basically what Boris Johnson said. He said, look, we have vaccines that are widely available and free. Get boosted.
Yeah.
Be safe, but that's as much as we can do as a government at this point. And I think, the vast majority of people, so we again polled on this and almost 75 or 80% said, yeah, it's time to lift the restrictions. The reality is he's also operating with probably the same poll numbers and everyone wants them gone. He kind of has to do it at this point.
Yeah, I think the really hard thing, people who are healthy and who are boosted and so forth, the risk is maybe lower at this point. But for people who don't have the antibodies, who have, the kids are too young or for whatever reason their health is such that they can't get vaccinated or they can't develop the antibodies or something, like those are the people who...
That's right. It's tough.
They're going to be at risk.
Just because you mentioned the risk, I think there's a very interesting article that I read about how do we all start thinking about risk again? Because we live with all kinds of risks every day. We don't really run the math in our head. Like when you get into a car, you don't think, wait a minute, I have a 2.4 out of a million chance of dying
Well,
here.
Unless you're in the process of teaching your kid to drive.
That's true. Not looking forward to that stage with my children. But the point being that we live with a lot of risks that are bigger than COVID risk for most of us that don't have, that are not compromised in some way. So, but we don't really have a language. We don't really have a way of thinking about it. So this scientist, I think he's a data scientist from a long time ago, had this idea of a micromort, which is a 1 in a million chance of death. And so you measure in micromorts. It's a verb. I mean, it's a noun that you could sort of use.
Micromort.
Yeah, exactly. A little morbid, but I mean, it's the right thing. And so he basically said, look, the COVID, I think, is like 1 micromort, but driving is like 2.4 micromort and something like that. And said, COVID is not as high a risk as many things that we live with. It's time to accept it. Again, for some people and some populations, it's not 1 micromort.
Right.
But for most of us it is, and that's why we need to get on with it, and everyone else needs to understand how to measure risk and take that into consideration. But yeah, I feel for, like we're sitting here and you and I are very fortunate to be quite healthy and have healthy families. Could you imagine if your child was compromised in some way? Like you can't go into any closed environment without worrying. It's not right that we would enforce a lifestyle on other people for it, but I can also understand how tough it must be for that family and that child. So it's hard, like everything in the news, never usually easy answers.
Yeah.
But that was a big story, and I think after UK doing it and Denmark lifted all restrictions and Sweden's done it as well, I think it's coming. The United States largely has lifted it as well in a lot of places. I think sort of a blanket lifting may also soon happen given the way things are going in Europe.
Yeah.
Well, I'd say those are probably the 3 biggest stories of this week.
Yeah, there are definitely a few other big ones, but
yeah,
you can't cover them all.
No.
So I would say go to the Factual if you want to find out about some of the other big stories, right?
Yeah, please do. Follow us on social media, on Instagram, where you can see Factual Fridays with Jill and me every Friday. And otherwise, we'll see you back here next week.